I don't know if I can recommend this comic to you. That's a strange way to start a video, I know, but after struggling over and over again to find the right way to talk about this story, I give up. Black Hole is one of the greatest graphic novels I've ever read, and one of the most terrifying comics I'll ever discuss on this channel. If you've seen my videos before, you know that's a pretty bold claim, because I've covered some pretty messed up stories. So why did I just say I don't know if I can recommend it to you? Well, Black Hole isn't a story that's going to work for everyone. Set in the suburbs of Seattle in the mid-1970s, Black Hole follows a group of teenagers who contract a mysterious sexually transmitted disease known as the Bug, which causes its host to experience bizarre and grotesque bodily mutations. Some of these mutations can be subtle: webbed fingers, a small tail, an extra mouth. Others undergo far more extreme transformations, their whole bodies warped into grotesque, almost zombie-like forms. We see how the characters grapple with their mutations as they are shunned by their peers and forced into isolation. What makes Black Hole so disturbing is the way it blends grotesque body horror with the quiet, creeping dread of adolescence, using the surreal and unsettling transformations of the Bug as a metaphor for isolation, shame, and the loss of innocence. This comic explores a lot of very real and uncomfortable themes, such as sexuality, innocence, drug use, anxiety, and assault. And because it's a story about teenagers, some people may be uncomfortable with seeing these issues through their perspective. While I do understand that reaction, it's important to acknowledge that these are struggles many young people actually face. It may be uncomfortable, but it's also reality, and we shouldn't ignore that. Now, I want to clarify that when I say this story is disturbing, I don't mean it's disturbing in the same sense that something like Crossed by Garth Ennis is disturbing. Black Hole isn't gory or excessively violent. Its horror is far more psychological. If you want to think of it in terms of movies, Black Hole would be more along the lines of The Babadook than it would Evil Dead. With that being said, there are going to be a few people who may find some of the imagery in this comic to be too unsettling, particularly when it comes to the body horror. There is also a lot of nudity and sexually charged imagery in Black Hole, which is going to make getting this up on YouTube really fun, but I guess if you're watching this, I made it work somehow. And there may also be some who don't find Black Hole to be all that scary. They may think I'm overselling it, or that I'm just clickbaiting. Others might find it to be too slow, or maybe even boring. And yeah, it's definitely slower paced, but Black Hole is far from boring. It's a story that demands deep analysis and introspection to fully appreciate the horror woven into its pages. So if you don't like slower pacing or critical thinking, then I don't know, maybe I'll put a clip of someone playing Subway Surfers at the bottom of the screen to help you out. Black Hole was written and illustrated by Charles Burns. Burns grew up in Seattle, which is where the story takes place, and has said in interviews that high school was a very difficult time for him. He felt like an outsider during his teenage years, which makes this comic a deeply personal story for him. Black Hole was originally published as a 12-issue miniseries from 1995 to 2005, with a new issue releasing on average every 10 to 12 months. It has since then been collected into one single volume. The first 4 issues were published by Kitchen Sink Press before they went out of business. The series would then get turned over to Fantagraphics, who would publish the last 8 issues. An early version of Black Hole called Contagious was featured in the first issue of the horror anthology series Taboo. This story, while only being 4 pages long, shares a lot of the same themes we would eventually see in Black Hole. Just looking at the artwork, it's easy to see why it took 10 years for Charles Burns to complete this comic. Inspired by 1950s horror comics and David Cronenberg movies, Burns' distinctive deep black color and smooth line work create this eerie and dreamlike quality in every panel. The visuals blend classic horror aesthetics with surreal, nightmarish imagery. Characters often have emotionless, vacant expressions, adding to the story's underlying sense of dread, while their black, void-like wounds and shredding skin serves as a powerful metaphor for transformation, decay, and alienation. Burns also plays with contrast and setting. His use of deep shadows and rigid, inky black figures against fluid, organic, natural elements reinforce the character's detachment from the world. The result is a visually haunting experience that doesn't just illustrate the horrors of adolescence, but immerses the reader in its suffocating unease. Black Hole is one of the most bizarre and surreal stories I'm ever going to talk about on this channel. It's a haunting exploration of adolescence and transformation, wrapped in a nightmarish atmosphere that feels both intimate and unsettling. Charles Burns crafts a world where body horror isn't just about shock, it's a metaphor for the fear, shame, and isolation that comes with growing up. The true horror isn't just the physical mutations, the emotional scars that they leave behind. The story definitely isn't for the faint of heart, but I still hope I have a good amount of people with me, because because behind all the darkness is a beautifully tragic story that I can't wait to share with you today. So, with everything else out of the way, let's finally get into it. This is Black Hole. Keith Pearson and Chris Rhodes are lab partners in their Biology 101 class, where they are dissecting frogs. Keith has always had a huge crush on Chris, but he's never had the courage to ask her out. Outside of biology class, Chris barely remembers that Keith exists. Chris is one of the popular girls. She's also a straight-A student and an overachiever. Keith is a stoner and a social outcast. He knows in reality he has no chance of getting with Chris Rhodes, but it doesn't stop him from admiring her every chance he gets. As Keith begins dissecting the frog, he starts getting this strange feeling wash over him. Almost like deja vu, like he had experienced all this before. Then he starts getting these strange visions. I was looking at a hole, a black hole, and as I looked, the hole opened up, and I could feel myself falling forward, tumbling down into nothingness. Keith ends up passing out in the middle of class. When he wakes up, he sees everyone looking down at him and laughing. Everyone but Chris. Later, we see Keith and his friends Todd and Dee smoking in their favorite hangout spot in the woods they call Planet Xeno, although Keith can't remember why they called it that. As the boys finish off a joint, Keith sees someone watching them off in the distance. The boys go to investigate, and they find that someone is camping out in the woods. Keith goes out further in the woods to see if he can find anything else, while his friends start looking through the tent. While searching through the woods, Keith finds what looks like human skin hanging off of a branch. It was a skin. Someone had shed their skin in the woods. It was a girl's skin. There were moles, childhood scars, a map of some girl's life, a girl I'd never known. As I looked at it, a terrible sadness welled up in me. I felt sick of myself, sick of being stuck out in the woods, stoned and alone. But I wasn't alone. Go away. Go away. At first, Keith just thinks it's some guy in a Halloween mask trying to scare him. But the longer he stares, he realizes it's not a mask. This person has the bug. As he runs out of the woods, he sees a group of these deformed strangers stalking him. His friends discover the tent belongs to one of their old classmates named Rick Holstrom. They trash Rick's tent and begin heading back into town, unaware that another deformed figure is watching them from behind the trees. Later that night, Chris starts having this strange dream. She's standing by a river with a couple of guys she knows. One of them is completely naked, his penis twisted into a corkscrew shape, like a pig's tail or a snake. She feels a sharp pain in her foot and notices a piece of glass sticking out. When she pulls it out, she feels something else inside the wound. It's a scroll with an image of a giant sea serpent on it. Suddenly, Chris finds herself out in the middle of the ocean. She sees a bunch of people in front of her, eating trash that's floating in the water. One of these people is Keith, although she can't remember his name in the dream. Keith transforms into the giant sea serpent from the scroll and starts to strangle Chris. Chris wakes up from her nightmare, and we see that her skin is starting to shed, just like in Keith's vision. She rips off her shedding skin from her body, throws it out into the woods. Black Hole does this a lot, where it blends dream sequences into real life. You never really know how much of what you're seeing is real or just in the character's head, and a lot of the story is told out of order. This could make reading this comic a little bit more difficult, but that's the point. Burns wanted the reader to constantly question what they're looking at. Maybe Keith is in a coma after passing out in class. This is all just a dream. Black Hole leaves a lot of things open-ended. This may frustrate some, but for me, it just adds to the mystery of this comic. It had me analyze every panel, trying to see if I can piece this puzzle together. Chris has always had a huge crush on this boy named Rob, but she was always too shy to approach him. She sees Rob at a kegger party and decides to finally talk to him. The two hit it off, and they decide to step outside and share a cigarette. They take a walk to the cemetery, and after a few too many swigs of wine, they start getting intimate. Chris feels this almost animalistic sexual attraction to Rob at this moment. It's like every other faculty turns off in her brain, and the only thing she wants is to get in his pants. Chris? There's something I should tell you before we, I know. Chris thought Rob was going to say that he has a girlfriend, which she already knew. She knows what she's doing is dangerous, especially since they don't have any protection. But something inside of her takes over, and they start having sex. As Chris starts kissing Rob's neck, she notices something strange. There's this slit in the middle of Rob's neck. It looks like a deep cut. The slit opens and starts making this strange wheezing noise as Rob climaxes. This isn't a cut, it's a mouth, growing right in the middle of Rob's neck. He has the bug. That's what he was trying to tell Chris earlier. She starts freaking out, and Rob realizes that Chris had no idea he was infected. They walk back to the party in complete silence. Over the next few days, Chris would approach Rob and beg him to talk to her about what happened at the cemetery. He keeps coming up with excuses and starts avoiding her altogether. Word gets around that Rob and Chris snuck away at the party. Chris's friends try pressing her for details, but she refuses to say anything, terrified she might be outed for having the bug. She starts feeling really strange. At first, she's afraid that Rob might have gotten her pregnant, but after she gets her period, she realizes that the bug is starting to take effect. She starts looking around over her body, but she doesn't see anything different. She figures she might have some time before her body starts to change. A few days later, Chris goes out with her friends to another party by the lake. She still feels off and spends most of the night by herself. She eventually meets up with the others and decides to go for a swim in the lake. Chris undresses and notices everyone staring at her. She doesn't know why people are staring at her, and she doesn't care. All she wants to do is swim. We see that the skin on Chris's back has started to split open. Keith and his friends are at the lake too. Dee starts telling him that Chris has the bug. This really bothers Keith. He's not upset she has the bug. He actually doesn't really care. He's upset that she had slept with someone else. Despite the fact that Keith has never said more than 2 words to Chris, he still felt betrayed somehow. Like she was his even though she barely knew he existed outside of biology class. Keith's crush on Chris is slowly turning from a cute high school fling into a full-on obsession. He goes off into the woods to pee and sees Chris off in the distance. She got embarrassed from everyone seeing her back and stormed off from the lake. Keith watches creepily as Chris changes out of her wet clothes. He knows full well that what he's doing is wrong, but he can't look away. Suddenly, Chris falls down and starts screaming out in pain. Keith waits a few seconds and goes out to help her. I couldn't believe it. I was taking over, acting like I was in charge. I was touching her, and she didn't seem to mind. The cut, dark and open. It hit me hard. I could feel something turning inside of me. I'd seen it before, that same dark opening. I was starting to lose it, but I snapped out of it. I had to. I had to show Chris that I could take care of her, that I'd be there for her. Keith removes the glass from her foot and wraps his shirt around her wound. She thanks him for patching her up and goes back to her friends. That was all I needed. When she smiled at me, all the other stupid, ugly stuff just drifted away. As I waved, I saw the dark stains on my fingernails. Blood. Her blood. Dark and real. I'd been marked with her blood. It was a sign. I didn't know where, or when, or how, but she was going to be mine. It was going to happen. It had to happen. Keith and Todd head over to their dealer's house to buy some more pot. The entire time they drive over there, the only thing Keith can think about is Chris. He has some visions of caressing her face and holding her neck. Despite the fact that everyone knows Chris has the bug, that doesn't stop him from fantasizing about being with her. At this point in the video, it should be pretty clear to see that Keith isn't exactly the most charming protagonist in the world. A lot of his thoughts and his almost stalkerish obsession with Chris comes off as pretty creepy. And yeah, it is creepy. But Keith isn't really malicious. I think every guy could admit that when they were in high school, we had a lot of thoughts that we probably wouldn't like to admit out loud. Although, of course, not everyone goes to the lengths that Keith does. Nothing excuses spying on Chris changing in the woods. That was just downright creepy. After getting their weed, the boys start smoking and hang out with their dealers. They get thirsty and tell Keith to go grab them some beers from the fridge. When Keith walks into the kitchen, he sees a woman standing by the counter, naked from the waist down, with a lizard-like tail. Her name is Eliza. She lives at the house with the dealers. Keith starts apologizing for walking in on her, but Eliza said it's no big deal. She's something of a free spirit. She often walks around the house naked and doesn't really care about nudity. Of course, Keith is a little more concerned about the fact that this woman has a tail more than the fact that she's naked. Eliza seems to take a liking to Keith. She does a little hula dance for him and makes him a sandwich. She even invites him down to her room. Keith knows that he probably shouldn't follow her. He's never met her before, and all this is just really weird. But for whatever reason, he decides to follow her down to her room. As Keith follows her down the steps, he can see her tail wagging in her skirt, like a dog when they're excited. Keith realizes that he's actually starting to get sexually aroused by this. When they get down to Eliza's room, she shows Keith all of her artwork. Despite the weirdness of the whole situation, Keith is extremely impressed by her work. It's dark, but also has a sort of hidden beauty behind it. He starts admiring all her artwork, while occasionally throwing some glances back at Eliza. Keith can't figure out what it is, but there's something about her that really attracts him. I mean, there's no question that she's beautiful, but there's also this sort of exotic beauty to her that's hard to explain. Eliza brings out a pipe and fills it with hash, which is a cannabis concentrate that contains higher levels of THC than normal pot. Keith takes a hit. They both sit in silence for a while. Eliza notices that something is eating away at Keith. She starts digging into him for answers. He says that there's this girl, meaning Chris. Eliza lays Keith down in her bed and starts comforting him. He starts fantasizing about Chris again. This time, Chris starts disappearing, and Eliza takes her place in his mind. She asks Keith if he liked her tail. Before they can do anything more, one of the boys comes in and tells Keith that Todd's been looking for him. He gets up from her bed and goes back upstairs. After the party, Rob tries to keep his mind off of Chris, but he hasn't been able to stop thinking about what happened at the cemetery. He even dreams about it, which gets Rob in trouble with his girlfriend Lisa. While Rob was dreaming about Chris, the mouth on his neck was whispering her name. The two get into a fight and she eventually kicks Rob out of her house. With nowhere else to go, he heads into the woods to visit the infected teens. Being marked by the bug makes you a social outcast, and many of the infected teens chose to isolate themselves, forming a makeshift encampment on the outskirts of town. The group tells Rob that one of their friends, a girl named Lana, has gone missing. Even stranger, one of the teens says he found a severed human arm out in the woods the other day. They think there may be someone behind these disappearances. While they talk, the same ominous figure that was spying on Keith and his friends earlier stalks them from behind a tree. Since getting outed for having the bug, all of Chris's friends have pretty much abandoned her. She's been on her own, while she faces constant ridicule from her peers. She ends up running into Rob in the hallway. He says he thinks it's finally time they talk, and they decide to skip class and go for a walk. Rob apologizes and says it was never his intention to get her sick. It starts raining, so they take shelter under a bridge and share a cigarette. Chris knows she probably shouldn't get involved with Rob again. It's already caused her so much pain already. But once they're together, all her anxiety seems to vanish. Chris tells Rob about the first time she shed her skin. After the night at the lake, Chris stayed at her friend Marcy's house. She locks herself in the bathroom and checks on her back. She feels the skin in her back start to split and separate. She breaks down in the bathroom, and Marcy tries to comfort her. Later that night, Chris wakes up in her sleeping bag on Marcy's floor. As she slides her legs out, she notices the skin on her foot peeling away. Panicked, she starts tearing at it, and to her horror, it comes off in one large piece. Shaken, she steps into the shower and stays there until the hot water runs out. Rob comforts her and goes in for a kiss. Chris tells Rob that she wants to see his mouth again. At first, Rob is nervous. He's embarrassed by his mutation, but Chris promises that everything will be okay and starts kissing the mouth. She describes the taste and sensation. It was warm and salty. It was like the ocean, a clean, sharp taste, and further inside, a tiny tongue. I can feel it trembling, fluttering up against mine. The sensation becomes too much for Rob to handle, and he pulls Chris away. They stay in the woods together all night long. It's the weekend. Keith is stuck at home waiting for Dee and Todd to pick him up. His parents are watching some made-for-TV movie in the living room while he waits for his ride. Keith dreads the idea of having to stay home on a weekend night. His friends finally show up and Keith practically runs out the door. The two boys had dropped some acid before picking him up. They hand Keith the last hit they have, and he takes it without thinking twice. The boys go out to hang at Dee's girlfriend's house. They end up watching the same movie Keith's parents were watching, while Dee makes out with a girlfriend. Eventually, Dee and his girl go off to the bedroom and leave Todd and Keith to fend for themselves. Keith starts complaining that they're going to spend their whole night on the couch. Todd tells Keith that he's been all mopey since the whole thing with Chris by the lake. Annoyed by the conversation, Keith runs off to the bathroom. While he's there, he hears a noise coming from this painting in the woods. He stares at the painting and sees Chris again. The acid's starting to hit him hard. He freaks out and runs out the door. Walking didn't help. It was getting worse and worse. I came to an area with a whole bunch of little stores. Window after window filled with the most ungodly shit imaginable. None of it made any sense to me. I had to get away. I'd reached the overpass by our school, where there was a trail that led down to the woods. It seemed like the woods would be better. They were natural. Natural things make more sense. I found the first road that would go down to the Ravenna Park, but it was different now. It was glowing silver in the moonlight, like it was lit from within. It was alive, moving under my feet. A thick membrane, a skin. I was on the back of some terrible living thing, and it was making sounds now. Low, awful moaning sounds. I looked up to its eye. Dead. Empty. A flat hole staring down at me. Terrified, Keith runs off into the woods. It feels like something is chasing him. Something big and angry. It's like the trees themselves have come alive and are starting to close in on him. While running through the woods, Keith trips and finds the severed arm that one of the sick kids told Rob about earlier. After sobering up for a while, Keith starts walking back. He ends up finding the pit with the infected teenagers. At first, they were hostile to him, as they are with all strangers. But once they saw that Keith was no harm, they'd start treating him nicely. They even offer him some soda and something to eat. After sitting him down, the teens ask Keith what he was doing out in the woods anyway. He tells them about his bad acid trip and about finding the arm out in the woods. Keith actually starts to break down and cries. He feels as if his life has become a nightmare. Nothing feels real anymore. It's like a veil has been lifted from his eyes, and he sees the world for how truly ugly it is. The teens offer to walk Keith back to the Ravenna, but he says he would like to stay for a while. They spend the rest of the night silently staring off into the fire. Chris and Rob would spend the next few days together for as long as they could. Rob was the only person who could make Chris feel normal again. The only one who could make her forget about her life. We see them go on a date by the beach. The same beach Chris saw in her dream. She decides to go skinny dipping, and Rob follows in after her. They say they love each other. They get out of the water and have a picnic on the beach. Later that night, they camp out in the woods and have sex again. For the first time in her life, Chris finally feels at peace, like nothing can go wrong. It doesn't matter that they're both infected with the bug. Just as long as they have each other, everything will be okay.
It won't work. It can't last. It's impossible. Never make it out alive. It won't work.
The next day, Chris ends up getting grounded when her parents find out that she's been skipping class. They forbid her from leaving the house or seeing Rob anymore. They still haven't figured out that she has the bug yet. Terrified that her parents might find out, Chris decides to run away. Over the next few days, Chris packs everything she can carry with her and waits until both her parents are out of the house to run away with Rob. They decide to camp out in the woods until they can get enough money to go wherever they want. They set up their tent near the encampment since Rob already knows everyone there. Once they get to the woods, one of Rob's friends named Dave helps them set up. While Rob still goes to school during the day, Chris stays in the tent all day waiting for him to get back. One day, when Rob was in school, Chris goes out to use the bathroom and stumbles across a makeshift sex doll that someone constructed near their tent. When Rob gets back, Chris said that she heard someone creeping around their tent at night. She's scared and starts thinking that running away from home was a bad idea. Rob holds her and promises that everything will be okay. A few weeks later, Keith is walking down the street when he sees Eliza sitting outside on her front porch. It had been a while since their first meeting, and Keith wasn't sure if he wanted to see her again. Not because he doesn't like her, but because there's still a part of him that hopes he can end up with Chris. He notices that she looks somewhat different this time. She looks tired, worn out, like she hasn't slept in a while. She has some bruises on her face, like she got hit. She invites Keith back inside her room. Keith notices that all her artwork is missing. She tells him that she's planning to move and had to trash all of her art. Keith suspects there's something she's not telling him, but he decides to leave it alone. They share a joint together and sit on Eliza's bed. At first, Keith feels kind of awkward around her, but after the weed starts kicking in, he gets more comfortable. They start kissing, slowly at first, and then they start getting into it. Eliza climbs on top of him and starts rolling another joint. She starts rolling back and forth on top of him. She doesn't even realize she's doing it. This gets Keith excited. A little too excited. He ends up how do I say this? He ends up finishing the race a little early. He makes an excuse to go to the bathroom and cleans himself up. When he walks out of the bathroom, he bumps into the pot dealers he was hanging out with when he first met Eliza. One of the dealers is really drunk and doesn't remember meeting Keith. He starts threatening him and telling him to leave. This freaks Keith out and he decides he's going to say goodbye to Eliza, then head out the door. That is until he finds her standing completely naked, waiting for him. They share another joint together and start having sex. This is the first time Keith has ever been with a girl. It feels good, but Eliza's tail keeps getting in the way. She tells him to hold her tail to keep it out of the way. He grabs it with his hand. As they start getting into it, he accidentally pulls the end of her tail off. He starts freaking out, but Eliza tells him that it's happened before. Her tail grows back, just like a lizard's. Keith spends the night at Eliza's while she falls asleep in his arms. Keith lays next to her while he examines the broken piece of her tail, fascinated by it. Back at the Lovebirds camp, Rob leaves for school for the day, kisses Chris goodbye. He starts walking out of the woods and runs into the same infected kid who was spying on him and Keith earlier. Oh, man, you scared me. I didn't see you. Do I know you? Look, I gotta get going. What? What's the problem? I gotta go. Wait, what are you doing? I don't even know you.
I had to do it. He told me I had to do it. Chris, I'm sorry it didn't work. I'm sorry.
It's summer now, and it's been a couple months since Rob's disappearance. Chris is still out in the woods, hoping that Rob will still show up one of these days. Dave would continue to check up on her every few days to make sure she was okay. She would stay by herself for a while, but eventually she would start going down to the pit with the other sick kids. Keith would start showing up and immediately attached himself to Chris like a lost puppy. She finds him kind of annoying, but she doesn't have the heart to tell him to leave her alone. He brings her sandwiches and other refreshments every day. One night, while they're at the pit, Keith convinces Chris to shower at this tract house he's watching while the owners are on vacation. She's reluctant at first, but eventually agrees and leaves with him. Inside, he makes a huge meal for Chris. She finds his obvious attempts at pleasing her almost pathetic, but again, she chooses not to say anything. He offers to make her a gin and tonic, which happens to be her favorite drink. She decides to let loose and has a few. As the alcohol starts to take its effect, Chris opens up and tells Keith everything. In the days following Rob's disappearance, Chris was in complete denial. She told herself that there must have been some logical explanation. Maybe Rob got grounded, or maybe he was sick or something like that. But after a few weeks passed, she finally comes to terms with the fact that Rob's not coming back. At first, she considers taking her own life with the gun that Rob gave her for protection, but she couldn't go through with it. At night, Chris would occasionally hear someone walking around her tent. She would run out thinking it could be Rob, only to find more of those strange totems hanging around. This is when she decided to start hanging out by the pit because she didn't feel safe by herself anymore. She did spend a few weeks living with her friend Marcy in her room, but after the two had a falling out, Chris went back out into the woods. While telling Keith all of this, Chris had a few more drinks than she was planning on. She was fairly drunk at this point. Keith puts her in his bed, and Chris dreams of lying next to Rob on the beach. Chris wakes up suddenly and finds Keith's hand resting on her stomach. She falls back asleep and has a dream of her floating out in the middle of the ocean. Chris ends up moving to the tract house. Over the next week, she would invite the rest of the pit into the house, along with a few stragglers they found along the way. New kids Keith has never met before. They end up trashing the place, leaving Keith in some hot water for when the owners return from vacation. Each time Keith checks on the house, he tries to see Chris, but she always locks herself away in her room. The truth is, Keith's kind of glad he doesn't have to see her anymore. He can't look at Chris the same anymore since the bathtub incident. A few days passed when Keith was checking up on her. He walked into the bathroom to see Chris lying motionless in the bathtub. She was completely drunk, and her body emaciated and broken. There was no life in her eyes. He remembers when he used to stare at her during biology class, how perfect she was then. He realizes that version of Chris is gone and probably never coming back again. Seeing her like this almost drove him to tears. He'd reach down and try and shake her awake, but when he touched her shoulder, a patch of skin came off of her. This incident would haunt Keith for days, even giving him nightmares about it. Now, whenever he thinks of Chris back in biology class and all the things he wanted to do with her, all he can see is Eliza. Although it's been a couple weeks since he last saw her, Keith still thinks about their first time together. Of course, having sex with Eliza didn't come without any risks. Keith ends up with the bug, and it manifests on his body in the form of these stringy growths that come from his side. They remind him of the tadpoles he used to catch with his uncle when he was younger. They don't really bother Keith all that much. He's able to cover them up with an ace bandage and go about his day normally otherwise. Later that day, when Keith's at work stocking shelves, he would end up running into Eliza. She looks a lot different than the last time he saw her. She looks alive and beautiful. Her eyes are full of life, and her smile is bigger than ever. She lives at her friend's house now, and she's like a completely new person. They get to talking for a little bit, and she gives Keith her new phone number. After work, on his bike ride back to the tract house, Eliza is the only thing Keith can think about. When he walks inside the house, he sees all the other kids sitting at the table eating everything from the fridge. Chris is there too, just staring at him, not saying anything. Her eyes empty. This would be the last time Keith would ever see Chris again. A few days later, as Keith is walking towards the house, he notices that Chris's window is wide open. This is strange as she always locks herself in her room during the day. He walks through the door and smells the putrid odor of gunpowder. He sees the kids lying on the floor. They've all been shot to death. In the days leading up to the shooting, Chris and Dave got really close. Dave was the only person Chris didn't mind spending time with. He was nice, and he helped her out a lot when she was out in the woods. He'd bring her wine. They would drink together and talk for hours on end. The more time they spent together, the more personal their conversations would become. Chris tells Dave how bad she wishes she can go back to the way her life was before she got the bug. Back when she was in school, still with her friends, her family. Dave says he would never go back to his old life, even if he had the choice. He actually likes being infected. Before Dave got sick, he was already an outsider. He would get bullied relentlessly at school. Things would get worse when his bullies would start beating him. The only friends Dave had were other outcasts. They were looked down upon by their other peers, mocked, ridiculed. Dave was like a specter. Most people never even noticed him, and those who did were needlessly cruel to him. Everyone except Chris. Chris was the only person who treated Dave like an actual human being, the only one who didn't make him feel like a freak. She was the only person who ever showed him even an ounce of kindness. One day, instead of wine, Dave brought her a bottle of vodka. He was drinking a lot more than he usually does. In a drunken stupor, he admits to Chris that he's in love with her. Dave asks her to hold him. Chris is really weirded out by this whole situation, but she feels bad for Dave and decides to try and comfort him. But then, Dave tries to kiss her, and Chris pushes him away. Dave tries to apologize, but Chris just kicks him out of her room. A few hours later, Dave comes back drunker than he was before and starts pounding on Chris's door. She opens the door, and Dave tries to apologize for making a move on her. Chris looks down and sees that Dave has a gun. Her gun. The one that Rob gave her. He stole it from her tent. This is when Chris realizes that it was Dave sneaking around her tent at night and leaving all those creepy dolls behind. He was the one stalking her the whole time. Chris locks the door and escapes through the window. She starts hitchhiking, not sure where she's going. Dave walks into the living room and shoots the other kids. After the shooting, Dave goes to KFC to pick up some chicken. As one does after killing a bunch of teenagers. While waiting for his chicken, the guy standing behind Dave in line starts giving him a hard time. He says that he's scaring everyone in the store and should just leave. Dave begs him to leave him alone and just let him get his food. When the guy continues to harass Dave, he pulls out Rob's gun and threatens to kill him if he doesn't leave him alone. And while we're waiting, I want to show you something. All of you. You, get down on your knees. What? No way! Get down now, or I'll kill you. That's good. Now open your mouth. Do it, or I swear to God, I'll blow your brains out. There. Now don't move. See how easy that was? That's all it takes. A little spit, some saliva, and now you're one of us. Please, just leave. Please. You're crying for this guy? Maybe I should take you with me. Take you out to the woods for a few days. I could really give you something to cry about. But I'm done with all that. I'm done. Have a nice life. After getting his chicken, Dave visits the creep who killed Rob, who we now know is actually Rick Holstrom. It was Rick's tent that Keith and his friends found all that time ago. He was the one stalking them the whole time, and he's the one who killed Rob. But now we understand, he wasn't doing these things on his own. He was being controlled by Dave. While Rick chows down on some chicken, Dave pulls out his gun and shoots Rick in the back of the head. He then turns the gun on himself and shoots himself out in the middle of the woods. Back at the house, Keith finds two survivors who are hiding out in the bathroom, Doug and Carla. Carla explains that after Dave stopped pounding on Chris's door, he walked into the living room and killed everyone. Keith had been contemplating on running away and starting a new life somewhere else for a while, but this would be the event that would make him reach his breaking point. He packs up all his things and sets out on the road with Doug and Carla. Before he leaves, he decides to call Eliza and ask her to come with him. They drop Carla and Doug off at Carla's sister's house and drive south until they find a nice spot where they can rest at. Keith finally asks her why she decided to trash all of her artwork. One day, while she was still living with the dealers, they drugged her at a party and started vandalizing all of her artwork. She tried stopping them, but they ended up beating her unconscious and assaulting her. When she awoke, she found she was sore and bruised all over, especially between her legs. They had written derogatory words all over her body and destroyed all of her art. This is why she looked so horrible when Keith saw her the second time. They check into a motel and spend the night in each other's arms. They decide they're going to spend the rest of the money they have to see as much of the country as they can. When they get tired of traveling, they'll find an apartment somewhere where Keith can get a job while Liza works on her art all day. They're both scared. Scared of the future, of the past, of a lot of things. But they still have each other, and that's enough for them. They're not sure what their future has in hold for them, but that's okay. As long as they still have each other 20, 30 years down the line, it doesn't matter where they are. They'll be happy. After escaping from the tract house, Chris just walks down the road for a while. Eventually, she gets picked up by a hitchhiker. She tells him to drop her off at the beach, the same beach that she and Rob had their date on. It feels like years ago now. Chris doesn't know what to do, or where to go. She figures she'll probably go back home eventually, but for now, all she wants to do is to be in the water and stare up at the stars. This is where the story ends. Black Hole is one of the most surreal comics I've ever read. Every page feels like you're slipping further down into the most intense fever dream you've ever had. Charles Burns created a haunting and surreal universe through his distinctive black and white art style, where every panel radiates this eerie, almost dreamlike quality. His ability to fully immerse you into this dark and depressing world is beyond amazing, and the way he's able to fill every page with pure and utter dread is like nothing I've ever seen before. The body horror here is something out of a Junji Ito manga. In fact, Black Hole reminds me a lot of Ito's works. Both Ito and Burns are masters of creating these worlds where they feel real enough to live in, but twist them to these hellscapes that make you terrified of the idea that there's a world where these horrors could exist. When reading this story, a lot of people are going to draw some parallels between the bug and the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s. Much like HIV, the bug carries a stigma that isolates those who contract it, forcing them into hiding and cutting them off from their previous lives. The infected teens in Black Hole are treated as pariahs, much like how those diagnosed with AIDS were often ostracized, feared, and misunderstood. Additionally, black hole reflects the paranoia and uncertainty surrounding sexually transmitted diseases, especially during the heights of the AIDS crisis, when misinformation was rampant. Even today, there are still people who think you can get HIV by just touching an infected person, or that HIV is just a virus that affects gay men, both of which are false. In how both viruses are transmitted, the bug and HIV are almost identical, although in real life you can't contract HIV from saliva. No one fully understands the bug. There's no cure. There's no clear explanation where it came from, and those infected are left to fend for themselves, much like how many AIDS patients in the early years of the epidemic were abandoned by society and even the healthcare system. While there are a lot of parallels between the bug and the AIDS crisis, I do find that a lot of people who analyze black hole tend to hyper-focus on this point. Another unique aspect of the bug is that it only affects teenagers. As these teens become infected, they're forced to grapple with their physical transformations. They must also face the harsh reality of isolation. It doesn't matter who you were before you caught the bug. A jock, a nerd, a stoner, a cheerleader. Because once you become sick, you're just a freak, an outcast, someone to be laughed at and ridiculed. These kids are ostracized by their peers and treated as lesser human beings. They're marked by their deformities. It's like a twisted version of the game tag. Once you're it forever. Most of them chose to exile themselves to the woods rather than endure life among the uninfected. Yet, in their shared exile, they form something resembling a family. Out there, it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, popular or forgotten. Once you're infected, you're one of them. You may have noticed that there are barely any adults in Black Hole, and whenever we do see them, they're always shown to be in opposition with the kids. Burns has said that his parents were mostly absent from his life during his teenage years. He's also talked about how he felt like a complete outsider in school, not really fitting into any one group, but more drifting from group to group, never really finding his place. I don't know this for a fact, but I suspect Charles Burns was a lot like Keith in school. Just a kid who struggles to fit in and feels like the world is crashing in around them. High school serves as the perfect setting for a horror story, considering how intense and formative those years can be for so many people. I believe this divide between the teens and the adults symbolizes a much larger problem. Black Hole is a story about adolescence. It's about that awkward stage in life where you're in between a kid and a young adult. A period in your life where you're both nostalgic for the past and absolutely terrified of the future. This is why a lot of kids around this age go through a phase of rebellion. They have a natural inclination to fight against the adult world. We try to cling to our freedoms, but we are in no more control of getting older as the infected teens are of controlling their mutations. As much as we wish we could, we can't stop ourselves from aging. High school is the most formative years of your lives. This is when you die as the person you were and are reborn to the person you'll likely be for the rest of your life. And that's really scary. What if you don't like this new version of yourself? Is this it? Is this the person you're going to look at in the mirror for the rest of your life? What happened to the kid who was carefree, fearless, loved the world and everything in it? Everything was new and interesting to you. Now, life doesn't seem as colorful as it used to be. Suddenly, things you used to enjoy as a kid seem trivial to you now. What happened to the kid who told themselves they wouldn't become just another cog in the machine? Have you become the very thing you hated? A boring adult with a boring job and a boring family. What would you sacrifice just to have a day? Just one day to be that carefree kid again? You would give anything, wouldn't you? The whole world if you could. Unfortunately, we don't live in a world where we can make deals like that. Childhood is over, and there's nothing we can do to bring it back. One of the most interesting aspects of the story is how different characters react to their transformations. Notably, Eliza and Keith don't really let their mutations affect them. In fact, they almost embrace them. Rob and Chris felt disgusted and embarrassed by their mutations, and for them, running away was the only option left. In a few different interviews, Charles Burns has said that the bug represents a physical manifestation of whatever is going on internally. The disease is less about the horror of mutation and more about the character's internal fears and insecurities. I think this is shown most clearly in Dave. In a lot of ways, I think Dave's actually the most tragic character in Black Hole. Unlike our other four central characters, Dave is the only one who was treated like an outsider before he caught the bug. Sure, Keith wasn't exactly the most popular kid in school, but he was more of a ghost. He went mostly unnoticed, but he wasn't mistreated like Dave was. Dave was bullied on a daily basis. He was treated like a freak well before he started to mutate. When Chris says how much she wishes she can go back to her old life, Dave says he would never go back, even if given the option. I'd never go back. Not in a million years. Anything's better than all the crap I had to go through. Going to school, getting beat up almost every day, all those stuck-up girls laughing at me. F*** 'em. F*** 'em all. Unlike Chris, Dave took solace in his mutation. For the first time in his life, he finally had friends. He finally felt like he was somewhere where he belonged. He finally felt accepted for who he was. When he got rejected by Chris, he felt that even among his fellow freaks, he was still an outsider, a nobody. Dave represents an extreme reaction to being an alienated teen. He serves as an example of how the bug doesn't just reveal physical transformations, it also exposes deeper psychological and moral failings. He's a reflection of fear-driven, selfish masculinity preying on those who are lost and struggling. He takes advantage of Chris after manipulating Rick to kill Rob for him. He puts a facade as this nice guy who checks on Chris while she's still in the woods. In reality, he's controlling her, keeping Chris completely dependent on him. He feels that he's almost owed a relationship with Chris for showing her kindness. His physical mutation, which makes him look like a cat, symbolizes his coy and deceitful nature. He believes he's a victim, but in reality, he's no better than the bullies who made his life a living hell. Another idea we see present throughout this story is sex being this kind of doorway between adolescence and adulthood. This is how a lot of us viewed sex when we were around this age. Now, of course, we now know that having sex doesn't make you an adult. Being a responsible and grown person is what makes you an adult. But back then, we didn't see it that way. For us, sex was an ordinance, something you felt pressured to do. Unfortunately, a lot of young people give into that pressure before they're ready for it. And for those people, sex can be a very destructive thing. Sexual awakening is another theme we see throughout the story as well. We all remember going through puberty and having new thoughts and feelings we never had before. For a lot of us, these thoughts and feelings were scary. In Black Hole, we see characters engaging in sex with this almost animalistic attraction. Even with this bug going around, their urges dictate their actions and turn sex into this kind of monstrous thing. Now, I'm not saying Black Hole is some anti-sex, pro-abstinence propaganda. It's not that at all. But I do think it serves as a warning. In school, we were all taught that premarital sex is bad because it comes with the risk of disease. And yes, while that's true, what we don't talk about is the emotional baggage that can come with doing something you're not ready to do. Black Hole is a terrifying exploration into adolescence and the loss of innocence. It's a dark tale, but it isn't nihilistic. Keith and Eliza get their happy ending despite all the torture they had to endure throughout the story. Sure, they have some fear for the future, but they're also hopeful. Chris is a lot less sure. She may be able to go home and live a relatively normal life, but there's a piece of her that is lost forever. I think this is a good metaphor for life. We're all going to have fears of the future, but it's how we respond to those fears that shape us. We can't change our past, any more than the affected kids can change their mutations. We also can't go backwards in time, no matter how much we wish we could. You're not the person you used to be. You shed that skin already, and that's okay. You don't have to look at the future like it's some kind of dark storm peering over the horizon. Change isn't just about loss, it's about growth. The past may leave its marks on you, just like the bug leaves its scars, but those marks don't define who you are. Moving forward doesn't mean forgetting where you came from. It means embracing the person you've become. The unknown will always be unsettling, but it doesn't have to be terrifying. Sometimes all we can do is to keep going, even if we don't know exactly where the road will take us. If you made it this far into the video, then I'm going to ask that you leave a like, comment, and subscribe, because there's a lot more like this to come. If you'd like to support me, then please consider checking out our Patreon, where you get a lot of awesome benefits, such as watching all my videos days in advance before they're up on YouTube, as well as being completely uncensored. You also get access to our exclusive channel Discord, where you get to vote on future videos, and you can get your name at the end of every video. Speaking of which, I'd like to give a shout out to every name you're seeing on the screen right now. I used to read these out, but it's gotten so long that it would take me a while to read all these names out. Before I get out of here, I do want to mention that there's this really awesome short film based on Black Hole that's completely free to watch, and it's up on YouTube, so I'll link that down below so you guys can check it out. And yeah, that's pretty much it. See ya. Man, this short film is really good. I wonder who directed it. Rupert Sanders. Wait, no, it can't be the same guy, right? It's got to be a different Rupert Sanders. Hold on. Huh. That's, huh.